On a pale October morning in Street Mary Mead, the mist lay low over the hedgerows, giving the cottages and churchyard a soft, ghostly hue. The postman's bicycle squeaked along the lane as he balanced a bulging canvas bag on his shoulder. He was a reliable figure in the village, always whistling, always cheerful. But today, his tune faltered as he wheeled toward the vicarage, with an unusual package wrapped in stiff, brown paper. Inside the vicarage, the Reverend Julian Faraday was pouring tea for his wife when the knock came. Mrs. Faraday glanced up at the clock. "Early for the post," she murmured. The postman handed over the parcel with a tight smile, his hands slightly trembling from the cold. Neither he nor the vicar's wife noticed the faint smudge of red wax on the twine, nor the faded return address marked simply, "The Old Rectory." 4. By mid-morning, gossip was already stirring at the High Street shop. The grocer's wife remarked that the postman had skipped his usual chat and left in a hurry. At the Bluebell tea room, Miss Marple stirred her cup thoughtfully, listening as two villagers speculated about the strange package. Her blue eyes, mild and curious, missed nothing. The pallor in the postman's face, the whispered mention of an old rectory no one had lived in for years. She said nothing, only smiled faintly, and asked whether the tea cakes were fresh today. To anyone watching, she seemed absorbed in her knitting, but in her mind, the pattern of a different kind of thread was forming one that would soon tug loose the quiet fabric of Street Mary Mead. The Bluebell tea room had grown steadily louder after the morning post, its little brass bell jingling every few minutes, as customers came and went with exaggerated casualness. News of the unusual parcel at the vicarage had already blossomed into a dozen different tales, and each teller tried to outdo the other with speculation. Miss Hartnell swore she had seen the postman's bag, bulging like a sack of bricks. Mrs. Price whispered that it had rattled like bones. Seated quietly near the window, Miss Marple let the talk wash over her as she counted her stitches and noted the precise phrases each villager used. It was not the content that interested her so much as the tone, the hurried, nervous way they spoke, as though repeating something they half believed themselves. She left the tea room before noon and strolled down the lane toward the vicarage, her boots brushing through the fallen leaves. The village still smelled of damp wood smoke, and behind lace curtains faces appeared briefly, then vanished. When she reached the garden gate, she found Mrs. Faraday standing on the gravel drive, hands clasped tightly around a folded apron. "A dreadful business," the vicar's wife said at once, though she had not yet been asked. "Julian's quite upset, though of course he won't say. That parcel, well, it's not at all what we thought." She hesitated and glanced back at the house. "He's had to call the constable." Inside, the air was sharp with the scent of old paper. The brown wrapping lay torn across the vicarage dining table, its twine curling like shed snakeskin. On the cloth sat a postman's leather satchel, not the usual kind, but an older model cracked with age. The brass buckle was dulled by fingerprints. Constable Wilkes, a young man with an earnest frown, was bending over it, while Reverend Faraday stood stiffly nearby. Miss Marple did not step forward. She lingered by the door as though merely passing. "Found it wrapped up like a book parcel," Wilkes said to no one in particular. "But it's empty now, or nearly so." He lifted the flap to show the interior lined with grey canvas. A single slip of paper clung to the seam. He plucked it out gingerly and read, "Deliver where the whisper stops." He blinked. "Doesn't make sense to me." Reverend Faraday cleared his throat. There was something else. Inside, a pair of gloves. Men's gloves. Very fine kid leather. "Not mine, I assure you." Miss Marple murmured something polite about how strange the world was becoming and inquired, in a voice as mild as milk, whether the postman had explained why the parcel came to them. Wilkes said the man had not been found. After handing it over, he'd left his bicycle leaning against the grocer's wall and disappeared from his route. No sign of him since. Wilkes added, "Could be nothing. Could be serious." Mrs. Faraday, pale now, whispered that the gloves had smelled faintly of some odd perfume. "Not flowers," she said. "Something like ink or old wood." Miss Marple's eyes lowered to her knitting bag, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She remembered a summer fair 3 years before, when the postman Arthur Noakes, that was his name, had refused a slice of seed cake from a certain guest, a retired schoolmistress newly arrived from Devon. Everyone had laughed at his sudden queasiness. Only Miss Marple had noticed that he'd gone white as chalk when she'd mentioned the old rectory. She offered to make tea, while Mrs. Faraday busied herself in the kitchen. Miss Marple drifted to the window and studied the vicarage garden. The gravel path wound down toward a locked gate where ivy grew thick over the hinges. On the far side, the lane curved away toward the disused rectory grounds abandoned for years, its windows shuttered. A faint impression in the gravel, 2 parallel lines showed where a bicycle tire had been wheeled, stopping short at the gate. She turned back as Mrs. Faraday returned with a tray. "Do you recall, my dear?" Miss Marple said in her most conversational tone. "If Mr. Noakes was in the habit of carrying more than one bag on his route." "Certainly not," Mrs. Faraday replied. "Only the one." "Why?" "Oh, idle curiosity," Miss Marple said and took her cup. In truth, she was assembling a mental timetable. The parcel had been delivered at 9:15. The postman had vanished soon after, leaving his bicycle. The gloves, the cryptic note, and the satchel pointed to something planned rather than impulsive. Constable Wilkes, scratching his head, announced he must search the lane between the vicarage and the rectory grounds. "Could be our man had an accident," he said, though without conviction. Reverend Faraday offered to accompany him. They left together, boots crunching on the drive. Mrs. Faraday went upstairs to rest, leaving Miss Marple alone with the empty satchel and the faint smell of inked leather. She bent over the bag without touching it. Inside, a thread of bright blue wool clung to the seam, unmistakably the sort used for schoolboy scarves. She straightened slowly, her knitting needles motionless. A schoolboy in street. Mary Mead had such a scarf. She had seen him cycling toward the old rectory only yesterday, a bundle of letters in his hand. A helper for the postman, perhaps, or something else entirely. Miss Marple left the vicarage quietly. Outside, the mist had thinned, but the air held a metallic chill. Down the lane, beyond the hedges, she glimpsed Wilkes and Reverend Faraday approaching the rectory gate. Even at a distance, she could see Wilkes kneel and lift something from the ground, something small, glinting. He pocketed it before the vicar could look. She made a mental note of that. Her next stop was the grocer's. The abandoned bicycle still leaned there, and on its frame she saw a smear of red wax, like the seal on the parcel. She asked the grocer's boy, in her gentle way, whether he had seen Mr. Noakes since morning. The boy shook his head but said the postman had spoken briefly with a stranger, a man in a brown overcoat carrying a valise, just before disappearing. Said he was asking the way to the old rectory. The boy added. Miss Marple thanked him and continued her walk, her knitting tucked under one arm. She did not head for home but for the footpath skirting the churchyard, from which one could watch the rectory grounds unseen. The ivy-grown gate, the abandoned house, the note's strange words. Deliver, where the whisper stops. They were pieces of a pattern still forming. She paused at the yew hedge, feeling the damp earth beneath her shoes, and watched Constable Wilkes pacing near the gate while the vicar stood off to one side. The constable's pocket bulged slightly where he had slipped the glinting object. He looked about, as though worried someone might be watching, then turned toward the rectory and vanished through the gate. The vicar remained outside, glancing nervously at the trees. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. There was more than one mystery here. She felt sure the vanished postman, the cryptic parcel, and perhaps a policeman whose eagerness to find clues was not entirely innocent. She began to retrace her steps toward her cottage, mind already arranging the next quiet question to ask. the next small kindness to offer that might draw out a telling slip of the tongue. She had learned long ago that in villages, secrets are rarely buried, they simply drift like mist until the right breeze clears them away. And somewhere beyond the hedge, the whisper was about to stop. Miss Marple's return to her cottage felt almost like any other morning stroll, but inside her mind the threads of the puzzle were tightening. She set her knitting on the side table, placed a fresh log on the fire, and poured herself a cup of tea as if the world beyond her garden hedge had not just shifted. From her window she could see the lane leading to the rectory, its hedges beaded with mist. Constable Wilkes and the vicar had not yet returned. That, too, was a small but telling thing. She sipped her tea slowly, considering the boy's description of the stranger in the brown overcoat with a valise. It was such a plain detail, yet plain details were the ones people forgot to disguise. By early afternoon, the bell at her garden gate tinkled faintly. When she opened the door, she found young Tommy Biggs, the grocer's errand boy who had spoken to her earlier, hovering uncertainly. His blue schoolboy scarf was looped twice around his neck, a little frayed at the edges. He held out a scrap of paper, folded small. "Found this near the shop," he muttered. "Might be nothing." His eyes darted away from hers. She thanked him warmly and waited until he had scurried off before unfolding it. The handwriting was cramped but neat, the ink blotted in one corner. "Third bag delivered. Whisper stops at dusk." She read it twice, then tucked it into her knitting bag. Third bag? She thought of the satchel at the vicarage. If there had been a first and second, where were they now? Miss Marple left her cottage again, this time by the back path that curved behind the churchyard, and emerged near the disused rectory. The air was heavier now, the mist thinning into a pale, cold light. She could see Constable Wilkes still at the gate, speaking low to the vicar, though their words did not carry. The constable's manner was brisk but guarded, as though he were guiding the conversation rather than sharing it. When the vicar gestured toward the trees, Wilkes shook his head sharply and slipped something from his pocket, a glint of brass, perhaps a key, before passing through the gate alone. Miss Marple crouched behind the yew hedge, her gloved hands steady. She had no intention of following him inside, not yet. She had learned that it was better to let people reveal themselves. Instead, she drifted toward the rectory's side path, a narrow track overgrown with nettles. Here she discovered the faint outline of bicycle tires pressed into the damp earth. 2 sets, side by side, one heavier, one lighter, both leading toward the back of the rectory grounds. She followed the marks a short distance until they vanished beneath a fallen branch. A sudden rustle ahead made her pause. Through the hedge she glimpsed the boy Tommy again, this time without his scarf, crouched near the rectory's crumbling wall. He seemed to be peering through a crack between the boards of a shuttered window. Miss Marple waited, then called softly, "Tommy, dear." The boy jumped and looked around guiltily. "Didn't mean nothing," he whispered. "Just heard a noise in there." "What sort of noise?" she asked, her tone as gentle as a grandmother's. "Like a bag being dropped. And someone talking. A man's voice." Miss Marple beckoned him closer, slipping a sugar sweet from her pocket into his hand. "Run along home now, and say nothing to anyone. Will you do that for me?" His eyes were wide, but he nodded and darted away, clutching the sweet. She watched until he had disappeared down the lane. The sun had begun to dip, casting long bars of pale gold across the grounds. She heard the vicar call out faintly, perhaps to Wilkes, but no answer came. A rook lifted from the rectory roof and wheeled into the sky. Miss Marple's hands tightened on her cane. Something was very wrong. She turned back toward the village and made straight for the telephone at the Bluebell Tea Room. A discreet call to Inspector Druitt at county headquarters would do no harm. She was careful to speak without alarm, framing her words as a small concern about the postman's disappearance and a curious package at the vicarage. Druitt, who had learned to take her small concerns seriously, promised to send a man at once. By the time she returned to the lane, the vicar stood alone by the gate, pale and anxious. Constable Wilkes went inside. he said when he saw her. Said he'd found something but told me to wait here. That was 20 minutes ago. Miss Marple offered him her arm and led him a few steps away from the gate. "You've been most patient, Reverend," she murmured. "But patience must sometimes give way to prudence. Did you see what he held when he went in?" "A key, I think," Faraday replied. "Said it was for an outbuilding." She nodded slightly, her suspicions coalescing. "And have you noticed, my dear, that Mr. Noakes, the postman, has still not been found, nor his second or third bag? Only this morning he was cheerful, and now—" She let the thought trail off. The vicar's brow furrowed. "Do you think the constable?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that someone in authority can sometimes move about with less suspicion than someone without. It can be a very useful disguise." She smiled faintly. "But of course, we mustn't jump to conclusions." She guided the vicar toward the village path, telling him it would be wise to wait at the tea room for Inspector Druitt. As soon as he had gone, she turned back to the gate. The ivy clung thick to the hinges, but she found a narrow opening where the wood had rotted. Through it, she could see the rectory garden choked with weeds and, at its far end, the outline of a small stone outbuilding, the old sorting shed, once used for parish records. Its door hung ajar. A faint sound drifted across the garden, like a muffled cough. Miss Marple slipped a hand into her knitting bag and closed her fingers around a small silver whistle she had once been given by a grateful constable after another case. She did not blow it, not yet, but held it ready. She stepped lightly through the gate and across the damp grass. Near the shed door lay a discarded leather strap, as if from a bag. Another satchel. She realized the second bag, perhaps. Inside the shed, a dim lamp burned. She could hear voices, one low and urgent, the other muffled. She drew nearer, her heart calm but quickening, and peered through a crack in the boards. Constable Wilkes stood with his back to her, bent over a third satchel. On the floor beside him, hands bound but otherwise unharmed, sat the postman Arthur Noakes. His mouth was gagged with a strip of cloth. The satchel Wilkes held was open, and from it he withdrew small packets of letters tied in blue wool. He rifled through them quickly, selecting some and discarding others, slipping a few into his own coat pocket. Miss Marple eased back from the crack and breathed out slowly. She had suspected Wilkes since she saw him pocket that glinting object by the rectory gate. Now she understood. Whatever scheme lay behind the cryptic notes and the gloves, Wilkes had been using his position to intercept letters, perhaps blackmail material, perhaps something more sinister. The whisper mentioned in the notes might be a code for a clandestine exchange timed at dusk. She retreated silently from the shed and returned to the lane, where she met the county inspector's car cresting the hill. She raised her hand, and the car slowed. Inspector Druitt stepped out, his expression grim but attentive. She leaned close and spoke in a low voice, recounting exactly what she had seen. He nodded once, signaling to his sergeant, and they moved off toward the rectory. Miss Marple remained by the hedgerow, the mist curling around her ankles like a patient cat. She watched the men disappear through the gate and heard, moments later, a barked command. A scuffle, then silence. Presently they emerged with Constable Wilkes between them, his face pale and stunned, and Arthur Noakes stumbling free beside them. Druitt glanced toward Miss Marple with a look of quiet gratitude. She merely inclined her head, as if acknowledging nothing more than the time of day. The sun had nearly set, and the air was filled with a hush that was not quite peace, but the pause after a storm. Miss Marple turned toward the village, her steps unhurried. There would be questions to answer soon enough, and the story would grow wilder in the telling. But for now, she allowed herself a small smile. The whisper had indeed stopped right at dusk, just as promised, and the next thread of the puzzle was ready to be drawn tight. The village felt strangely muted the next morning, as though the mist itself had absorbed the excitement of the night before. Church bells tolled softly in the distance, and shopkeepers opened their doors a little slower than usual. their eyes sliding toward one another with unspoken questions. Constable Wilkes had been driven off under guard, and Arthur Noakes, pale and shaken, had been taken to the vicarage to recover. The story of a constable-turned-thief had already begun to spread in crooked, whispered lines, each version growing more colorful by the hour. Yet for Miss Marple, seated at her little table with her knitting and tea, the matter was not finished. She had seen enough mysteries to know that the removal of one culprit did not necessarily solve the whole crime. She watched the lane from her window. Tommy Biggs passed by with his satchel of errands, glancing up at her cottage, as if seeking reassurance. The boy's scarf was back around his neck, its frayed edge twitching in the breeze. Miss Marple made a mental note. She would speak to him soon. There were still those blue wool threads she had found clinging to the satchel seams. Why had they been there at all? If Wilkes had acted alone? And what had become of the cryptic note she'd found, promising that the whisper would stop at dusk? Dusk had come. Wilkes had been caught. Yet she suspected the whisper meant more than the constable's small thefts. When she ventured to the vicarage after breakfast, the Reverend Faraday greeted her at the door with evident relief. "Thank heaven you're here," he said, ushering her inside. Arthur Noakes sat stiffly in an armchair, a blanket over his knees, his eyes darting around the room as if still expecting someone to pounce from the shadows. "Mrs." Faraday hovered behind him with a teacup, her fingers trembling slightly. "They've told me what happened," Noakes murmured hoarsely. "But it wasn't just Wilkes. He was meant to hand the bag over to someone else at the rectory. Said he was only keeping them safe until the right person came. When I tried to stop him, he gagged me." Miss Marple perched on the edge of the sofa, her needles clicking gently. "And the gloves, Mr. Noakes? The note? Those are rather curious details." His brow furrowed. "The gloves were given to me weeks ago by a gentleman who said he wanted his letters delivered discreetly. Paid me for my trouble. I didn't think much of it until parcels started turning up at the vicarage with no sender's name. Wilkes said it was some new arrangement with the county. But last night," he shivered and drew the blanket tighter. "Last night he told me I was in too deep and would have to be kept quiet until dusk." Mrs. Faraday set down the teacup with a soft clink. "And yet, you're alive," she said, her voice thin. "Because Miss Marple noticed what no one else did," Reverend Faraday said gravely. "She saved you, Arthur." Miss Marple gave a small, modest shrug. "One does one's best." Then she fixed her bright blue eyes on Noakes. "This gentleman who gave you the gloves, was he tall, perhaps with a brown overcoat?" Noakes nodded, his eyes widening. "Yes. How did you—" "I have my little ways," she said mildly. "And did he mention the old rectory by name?" "He said it was the safest place for certain packages," Noakes admitted. "That no one would think to look there. He gave me a phrase, something about a whisper stopping. Told me to repeat it if anyone questioned me." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. "And did he say when he would collect these packages?" "At dusk today," Noakes whispered. "That's when Wilkes was supposed to meet him again." The clock on the mantel ticked, and Mrs. Faraday let out a small gasp. "But Wilkes is in custody. Surely this man won't come now." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though her eyes were far away. "On the contrary, my dear. If he believes his messenger has merely been delayed, he may come himself to ensure the delivery. People involved in such schemes often cannot resist checking when things go awry." She looked at the Reverend. "Might I impose upon you for a small favor, Julian? Would you lend me your garden chair and a view of the lane near the rectory at dusk? I think it would be most instructive." By late afternoon, the sky had cleared, leaving a pale wash of gold over the hedgerows. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage garden with her knitting bag beside her, appearing for all the world like an elderly lady enjoying the last warmth of the day. Yet every sense was alert. Behind a low wall, Inspector Druitt and his sergeant waited with quiet patience, their unmarked car tucked into a farm track. The vicar kept watch from an upstairs window, and Mrs. Faraday busied herself with the tea tray to steady her nerves. The first sign came at 5:15. a figure in a brown overcoat walking briskly down the lane, a valise swinging from one hand. He moved with the easy assurance of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere. Miss Marple's needles stilled as she noted the cut of his coat, the gloves tucked into his breast pocket, the faint smudge of red wax on the valise clasp. He reached the rectory gate, glanced around once, and slipped inside. Miss Marple rose slowly, stretching as if her back ached, and shuffled a few steps toward the gate, her head bent. Through the ivy, she glimpsed him heading straight for the outbuilding where Wilkes had held Noakes the night before. He paused at the door, took out a small brass key, the twin of the one Wilkes had used, and unlocked the padlock. From the farm track, Druitt's sergeant raised his hand. Miss Marple gave the slightest nod. The two men moved silently into the lane, timing their approach with the wind rustling the hedges. The figure in brown bent over, a stack of letters inside the shed, muttering to himself. "Such a tiresome business," he was saying. But once this last bag, the rest of his words were lost in the sound of boots on gravel. Inspector Druitt stepped into the doorway. "Good evening, sir. Looking for something?" The man spun, eyes wide. But Miss Marple had already slipped behind him, blocking the path with nothing more threatening than her knitting bag. He stared at her, startled, as if realizing too late the mild old lady at the tea room had been watching him all along. Druitt's sergeant seized the valise, and a bundle of letters spilled onto the floor, sealed envelopes addressed to various villagers. Some of them clearly blackmail notes, others checks and small valuables. The man's face hardened. "You don't understand," he hissed. "These people deserved it, every last one of them. Their secrets are filth." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "And yet you found profit in their filth, didn't you? Secrets are such fragile things. They can be used kindly or cruelly. You chose the latter." He lunged toward the door, but Druitt blocked him neatly. In moments he was handcuffed, the valise secured. Druitt read him his rights with quiet efficiency while the sergeant gathered the scattered envelopes. Miss Marple stepped back into the garden, breathing in the cool air. The last rays of sun fell across the rectory's shuttered windows, making them gleam like dull gold. She felt no triumph, only a certain melancholy satisfaction. Human nature was endlessly inventive in its follies, and endlessly predictable in its vanity. As the man was led away down the lane, villagers began to appear at their doors, drawn by the sight of the inspector's car. Faces flickered behind curtains, whispers rose and fell. By tomorrow the tale would have grown into something grander, ghosts in the postman's bag, perhaps, or a conspiracy reaching to London. Miss Marple merely returned to her chair and took up her knitting again. There were still ends to weave in, questions to answer, but the pattern was now clear. She looked once at the rectory gate, where the ivy stirred faintly in the evening breeze, and thought how easily evil had hidden itself in the folds of everyday life. Then she smiled to herself, a small, private smile, and waited for Druitt to return with the final details that would tie every thread into place. The whisper had stopped, but its echoes would reveal everything before night fell. Miss Marple remained in her chair until the inspector and his men had driven the brown-coated stranger away. The twilight lay empty once more except for the echo of their boots. She felt the hush deepen as the villagers withdrew back behind their curtains. Only the faint sound of a distant dog bark and the rustle of ivy against the rectory gate disturbed the air. She gathered her knitting into her bag and rose slowly, the movement of an elderly woman content to return home, though inside her mind the threads of the evening's events were still moving, tugging at one another. The pattern was clearer now, but not yet complete. She walked back through the vicarage garden and found Reverend Faraday waiting by the porch, a question trembling on his lips. "Is it truly over?" he asked quietly. His wife stood behind him, her eyes shadowed by fatigue. Miss Marple gave him a reassuring pat on the arm but did not answer directly. "Arthur Noakes will need kindness," she said instead. "A man can be drawn into wickedness without quite knowing how, especially if he feels he's serving a larger purpose." She paused. And Tommy Biggs as well. He's been very near the edges of this business. The vicar looked startled. Tommy? Why? Only as an errand boy, Miss Marple said mildly. But errand boys sometimes carry messages without understanding them. The blue wool threads in the satchels were from his scarf. He must have been helping to tie up the letters. She smiled faintly. Children can be very trusting. Inside the sitting room, Arthur Noakes stirred from his chair as she entered. He looked less pale now, though his hands still trembled. "They've taken him, then?" he asked. "They have," Miss Marple replied gently. "But tell me, Arthur, did he ever speak of others? Anyone else who might come for these letters?" He frowned. He said something about a lady, a schoolteacher, who used to handle the lists. That she was gone now but might return. I don't know more than that. He always spoke in hints. Miss Marple felt a flicker of memory. The retired schoolmistress from Devon at the summer fair. The one who had made the postman turn pale at the mention of the old rectory. She tucked that away. "Thank you," she said softly. "Rest now. You've done enough." Later, as dusk deepened into true night, she returned to her cottage and lit a single lamp. The glow fell over her small writing desk where she kept a notebook of village goings-on. In neat, slanted script, she began to list the clues. The gloves scented of ink, the red wax smudges, the cryptic notes, the blue wool threads. Beside each, she wrote a small observation who had handled it, when it had appeared, and what it might mean. Slowly, a second pattern emerged beneath the first, like a watermark rising under heat. It was not only theft and blackmail. It was a kind of census of secrets, a catalogue of the village's private failings assembled with patient malice. Wilkes and the brown-coated man had been agents, but someone else had been gathering these fragments long before, waiting for the right moment to use them. Miss Marple set down her pen. She had no proof yet, only intuition, but she had learned to trust intuition when it lined up so neatly with human nature. A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Tommy Biggs standing on the step, his scarf missing again. He clutched a small envelope in both hands. "Found this under my pillow," he whispered. "Didn't put it there myself." She drew him inside and took the envelope carefully. It was sealed with red wax, the impression blurred but showing the faint outline of a quill crossed with a key. Inside was a single folded page. "Last list sent. Package tomorrow night. All will be silent." Miss Marple looked at the boy gravely. "You've done the right thing bringing this to me. Now, off you go home. Stay with your mother tonight." When he had gone, she sat a long time by the fire, the note trembling slightly in her fingers. "Tomorrow night. Another package. All will be silent." The words had the air of finality. Whoever had orchestrated the scheme was not yet finished. She thought of the schoolmistress, vanished from the village 2 years ago under vague pretenses. She thought of the gloves, men's gloves that might easily have been worn by a woman in disguise. She thought of the careful handwriting, neat but cramped, like a teacher's marginal notes. She rose and crossed to her telephone. Inspector Druitt answered on the second ring. She read him the message and heard his breath hiss softly. "We'll be ready," he said. "Where do you think they'll strike?" Miss Marple gazed out her window at the dim shape of the old rectory beyond the hedge. "If I were a betting woman," she said, "I'd say they'll come for the remaining lists themselves. And those are now at the vicarage, are they not?" "They're locked in my office," Druitt replied. "We thought it best to keep them there until morning. Then," said Miss Marple quietly, "they will not wait until morning." They agreed on a plan. Druitt and his men would conceal themselves near the vicarage after dark, while Miss Marple would sit once more in her quiet vantage with her knitting, a harmless old lady watching the lane. The trap would be set not for a man this time, but for whoever held the true design. When she hung up, she felt the familiar calm of approaching resolution. In the hearth, the log shifted and sent up a brief plume of sparks. She thought of all the little kindnesses she had exchanged with the villagers over the years. The cups of tea, the remarks on weather and knitting patterns, and how those small observations had become her map of their souls. She knew who bore grudges, who whispered at windows, who lied out of fear, and who out of greed. Only one person had both the knowledge and the nerve to weave so many lives into a single web. Outside, the night deepened. In the lane, a thin mist began to gather again, wrapping the hedges in a pale veil. Somewhere, a bicycle wheel clicked softly, and then was still. Miss Marple smoothed the note on her lap and folded it carefully into her bag. Tomorrow night would bring the final move, and she meant to be ready when it came. She doused her lamp and stood by the window, watching the old rectory's silhouette against the stars. Its shuttered windows seemed to blink like tired eyes. She imagined the unseen figure preparing somewhere nearby, believing the village still asleep and unsuspecting. A small smile touched her lips. Human nature, she reflected, rarely changed. It only thought it could, and when it thought itself cleverest was when it revealed its truest self. Now she had only to wait for the last thread to pull tight, and the whole tapestry of deception would show its design. The next day dawned sharp and brittle, frost crusting the edges of the hedgerows. Miss Marple rose early, her movements unhurried, her mind already shaping the evening's trap. She tended her small garden as if nothing were amiss, greeting the milkman, exchanging mild remarks with passing neighbors. Yet each face she saw reminded her of the catalogue she had built over the years. Who knew whom? Who owed favors? Who might have reasons for secrets? All through the morning she replayed Arthur Noakes's words about the schoolmistress and the packages, the boy Tommy's frightened eyes, the careful, teacherly script of the last note. Each thread lay quietly but firmly in place, waiting to be pulled. By afternoon, Inspector Druitt stopped by her cottage with an update. He was a tall, square-shouldered man who lowered his voice instinctively in her presence. "We've secured the vicarage," he said. "My men will be posted in the garden tonight. If your instincts are correct, our quarry will show themselves." Miss Marple poured him tea and listened. "They will show themselves," she said mildly. "For people who deal in secrets always assume no one else has noticed them. That is their undoing." She studied the inspector's face. "But you must be careful, my dear. This person is not merely greedy. They are clever and frightened. Clever and frightened people can be rash." Druitt nodded. "We'll be ready." At twilight, the village took on a hushed expectancy. Lamps glowed in windows. The smell of wood smoke drifted through the lanes. Miss Marple positioned herself once again at the vicarage garden, knitting in her lap, her chair angled to give her a view of the rectory path. Reverend Faraday had gone to the church on some invented errand, so he would not be in harm's way, and Mrs. Faraday busied herself upstairs with her curtains drawn. Druitt and two plainclothes men crouched behind the yew hedge, their eyes on the lane. Time stretched. The sky deepened to indigo. A lone owl called. Then, at precisely the same moment as the previous evening, a shadow moved at the far end of the lane. Not a man this time, but a slight figure in a dark cloak. Gliding rather than walking, a valise clutched close. The hood slipped back just enough for Miss Marple to glimpse a thin face framed by greying hair, the retired schoolmistress from Devon. Her eyes flicked left and right, alert but confident. She moved quickly toward the vicarage gate, unaware of the watchers. Miss Marple's needles paused. The woman's gloved hands bore the faintest smear of red wax. In her valise would be the final package, the true list of secrets, the evidence of her long, quiet manipulation. The woman slipped through the gate and headed for the rear of the house where the parish records were stored. Miss Marple rose slowly, easing her back as if stiff from sitting, and ambled across the gravel, appearing nothing more than an old lady stretching her legs. From the hedge, Druitt and his men shifted, preparing to move. Inside the garden, the schoolmistress knelt at the storage door, taking a small brass key from her cloak. She murmured something to herself, a habit of teachers, and set the valise down. Her hands moved swiftly but not nervously. She believed she was alone. Miss Marple's voice, soft but clear, drifted across the garden. "Good evening, Miss Abernathy." A bit late for schoolwork, isn't it? The woman froze. Slowly she turned, her expression flickering from surprise to a thin smile. "Miss Marple," she said, as though greeting an unexpected pupil. "I might have known." Miss Marple replied, still mild, "Though you've been very patient, haven't you? Collecting little notes, small confidences, bits of gossip and scandal for years. It takes a steady hand to build such a web." Abernathy's smile tightened. "A web? I call it justice. Do you know what this village did to me, Miss Marple? The whispers, the slights, the letters to the board that ruined my post. They left me with nothing. Nothing but their own filthy secrets to barter." Miss Marple tilted her head, her knitting bag hanging at her arm. "Ah, yes. Human nature can be unkind. But when one becomes the keeper of other people's sins, one must take care not to drown in them oneself." The woman's hands clenched. "You're very clever," she hissed. "But you can't stop this. Everything is ready. By dawn, I'll have enough to silence them forever." Miss Marple took a small step closer, her tone still grandmotherly. "My dear, you've already been stopped. Inspector Druitt." At her signal, the inspector and his men stepped from the shadows. Abernathy's eyes widened. She spun to flee, but found her path blocked. One of Druitt's men took the valise. The other produced a pair of handcuffs. For a moment, Abernathy stood very still, her shoulders rising and falling. Then she laughed, a brittle sound. "It's always the knitting old maid, isn't it? They never see you coming." She dropped the key into the grass and let herself be taken. Druitt's sergeant opened the valise. Inside lay dozens of sealed envelopes, ledgers of names and sums, even photographs. The inspector exhaled softly. "Blackmail on a grand scale," he muttered. "All from one quiet village." Miss Marple bent to pick up the fallen key and handed it to him. People underestimate the harm of small resentments when they accumulate. Miss Abernathy understood that. She only forgot that someone else might notice too. Abernathy was led away down the lane, her cloak fluttering like a dark wing in the lamplight. Druitt closed the valise and turned to Miss Marple. "How did you know she'd come?" "I didn't," Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling. "I only knew that secrets, like lost letters, eventually find their way home. And the old rectory is very nearly the post office of Street Mary Mead's forgotten sins." They walked back toward the vicarage together, the frost crunching underfoot. Behind them, the villagers began to emerge again, cautious and curious. The story would travel faster than any postman now. But Miss Marple only smiled faintly at the murmur of voices. Later, when the inspector had gone and the vicar and his wife had thanked her profusely, she returned to her cottage. She placed her knitting on the table and lit her lamp. The mist outside glowed pale around the hedges. She thought of Arthur Noakes, relieved but chastened, of Tommy Biggs, who would need guidance to keep his youthful trust from being misused again, of the Faradays, whose quiet home had become the stage for an unseen drama. She poured herself a final cup of tea and sat by the fire. In the hearth, the flames flickered gently, casting warm light on the familiar room. She felt no triumph, only the sober satisfaction of a puzzle resolved. Human nature had shown itself once more in its small cruelties and its strange compensations. And she, as always, had been merely an observer with a few pointed questions and a quiet eye for patterns. Outside, the last of the mist drifted from the lane, leaving the hedgerows silvered with frost. The old rectory stood silent again, its windows shuttered, its secrets emptied out. Miss Marple picked up her needles and resumed her knitting. The soft click of steel, a steady counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. In her mind, she turned the evening over once more, noting how each thread had led naturally to the next until the tapestry revealed itself. Miss Marple sat quietly for a long while after the inspector's car disappeared down the lane, the soft click of her needles the only sound in the cottage. The pattern she was knitting had begun as a simple scarf, but she found herself shaping it differently now. the rows of stitches reminding her of all the small, interlocked actions that had led from a single brown parcel to the unmasking of a woman's long, secret campaign. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. Outside, frost gathered again on the hedgerows. She had no desire for sleep yet. There were still a few threads left to secure, not for the sake of the police, but for the people of Street Mary Mead. In the morning she walked to the vicarage under a sky that had turned pale and clear. The village was stirring back to its routines, though a hush hung over it like the last note of a hymn. Mrs. Faraday met her at the door, eyes bright with questions she did not yet dare ask. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on the woman's arm. "It will take time," she said softly, "but things will settle. You and the Reverend have been brave." Arthur Noakes was in the kitchen, sitting up straighter now, his hands around a mug of tea. He looked ashamed but relieved. "I still don't understand how it all began," he murmured. "Why she chose me." "Because you were reliable," Miss Marple replied, easing into a chair opposite him. "And because she could make you believe you were helping. People like Miss Abernathy rely on that sort of loyalty. But loyalty can be turned." He nodded slowly. "I'll go to the authorities myself and tell them everything. I don't want any more secrets." "That would be wise," she said. "Truth, once begun, must be finished." She glanced at Mrs. Faraday. "And perhaps a kind word from you and the Reverend at the hearing would not be misplaced." Arthur was caught, but he also tried to stop it in the end. Later, she found Tommy Biggs loitering near the shop, scuffing his shoes against the pavement. His scarf was looped back around his neck, but the ends were tucked tight as though he wanted to hide them. When she called his name, he came at once, eyes downcast. She crouched slightly to meet his gaze. "You've been very brave, Tommy," she said. "But sometimes bravery means telling the truth even when it's hard." "I didn't know," he whispered. "She just said to tie up the letters. She gave me sweets." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I know, and you came to me when you realized something was wrong. That makes all the difference. You've helped stop something very bad." His shoulders eased a little. "Will they put me in trouble?" "No," she said firmly. "But you mustn't carry secrets for strangers again. You're not a postman yet." He gave a small, watery smile. She touched his shoulder lightly and let him go, watching him run back toward his mother's cottage. As the day wore on, she made her rounds quietly. One call at the tea room to reassure Mrs. Hartnell, another at the grocer's to return a borrowed book. She spoke of weather, of recipes, of the frost coming early this year. Nothing in her words hinted at the drama of the last nights, but each conversation gave her a clearer picture of how the village was knitting itself back together. Gossip smoothing into speculation, speculation into anecdote. Soon it would all be a story, half believed, like any other. That evening, Inspector Druitt called at her cottage once more. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand. "We've taken Miss Abernathy to County Gaol," he said. "She's already confessed more than we expected. Seems she'd been intercepting letters for years old, grudges, blackmail, even using Wilkes to gather what she couldn't reach herself. Without your notes, we'd never have pieced it together." Miss Marple poured him tea and listened. "It was never about proof, dear Inspector," she said mildly. "Only about seeing which small details didn't fit. A scent on gloves, a thread of blue wool, a phrase repeated once too often. Those are the things people overlook." He smiled faintly. "I suppose you're right. We think of evidence as fingerprints and footprints. You think of it as behavior." She tilted her head, her needles moving again. "Behavior leaves clearer prints than shoes, I find. It only takes patience to read them." They sat in companionable silence for a moment. Outside, the frost was silvering the hedges again, and a soft mist was rising from the lane. Druitt rose at last, thanking her once more. "We'll see to Arthur and the boy," he promised. "They won't be forgotten." After he left, Miss Marple remained by the window, looking out at the old rectory's dark silhouette. Its shuttered windows no longer seemed watchful, but weary. like a house that had given up its secrets at last. She felt a quiet sadness for Miss Abernathy, for Wilkes, even for the village itself, which would now carry a new story in its bloodstream. Yet she also felt a steadiness, a sense of order restored. Human nature might err, but it also mended itself given time and truth. She returned to her chair by the fire, laying aside her knitting for a moment to write a brief note in her small ledger. Ghost in the postman's bag concluded. Secrets exposed, children safe. She paused, then added, village unchanged. She closed the book, set it on the table, and took up her needles again. The scarf she was knitting had begun to form a pattern of interlocking diamonds, each row built on the last. No abrupt shifts, just a steady, logical unfolding, much like the case itself. The following evening, a hush lay over Street Mary Mead like a sheet of glass. The frost from the night before still glimmered in the grass, and the air smelled faintly of coal smoke. Miss Marple walked the familiar lane with her basket on her arm, stopping here and there to exchange mild words with neighbors who were already reshaping the previous week's events into stories. She listened, smiled, and stored their turns of phrase away. The way one stores wool for another project. Beneath the polite murmurs, she sensed relief, but also unease. The village had learned how easily its small secrets could be gathered up. At the vicarage, Arthur Noakes was packing a small suitcase to travel to his sister's in Dorset. Miss Marple had quietly arranged the journey with Inspector Druitt, and she watched now as Mrs. Faraday tucked sandwiches into the case. Arthur looked up at Miss Marple with an expression of gratitude too deep for words. "I'll write," he said softly. "Proper letters this time." "That will be very nice," she replied. "Honest letters have a way of finding their place." She squeezed his hand, then stepped back to allow Mrs. Faraday a moment with him. On her way out, she found Tommy Biggs waiting by the garden wall. His scarf had been washed, the frayed ends trimmed neatly. "Mum says I'm to help at the shop again," he told her. "No more running errands for strangers." "I'm glad to hear it," she said, her eyes twinkling. "And perhaps you'll help the vicar in the garden now and then. He could use a steady lad." He brightened. "I'd like that." She walked with him toward the high street, letting him chatter about school and the frost on the puddles. When they parted, she continued on to the tea room where she took her usual seat by the window. The bell over the door jingled as villagers came and went, their whispers already turning Abernathy's plot into a cautionary fable. Miss Marple stirred her tea, content to let them talk. She had seen it before. A story begins as shock, becomes gossip, then fades into a lesson people half remember when they need it. Inspector Druitt entered quietly and took the seat opposite her. His expression had softened from the hard lines of the previous nights. "We've traced Abernathy's old grievances," he said without preamble. She kept a ledger of them, parents who complained, officials who blocked her promotions, even children she believed had slighted her. She's confessed to orchestrating the entire affair. Wilkes was her tool, but she pulled every string. Miss Marple listened without surprise, then said, "It is a sad business when someone's bitterness outlives their better qualities. She must have been a capable teacher once." "She was," Druitt said. "The older villagers remember her, but she turned everything she knew about people into a weapon." He shook his head. "It's the first time I've seen a crime built entirely out of gossip. Not the first time it's happened," Miss Marple murmured, "but perhaps the first time you've seen it." She smiled faintly. "People think gossip is harmless, but in the wrong hands it's as sharp as any knife." They sipped their tea in silence. Outside the window, the children of the village ran along the lane, their laughter rising like birdsong. Tommy darted past with a stick, pretending it was a sword, his scarf trailing. Miss Marple watched him go, a small crease of affection softening her features. Druitt set down his cup. "There's one thing I still don't understand. How did you know it was Abernathy, not someone else?" Miss Marple laid her knitting across her lap. "Because only a teacher would choose that particular phrase where the whisper stops. It's a reference to a little game children play in classrooms, whispering a message from one to the next until it changes." She meant her parcels to be the last link in the chain, where the whisper stops. The gloves, the blue wool, the timing, they were all distractions. But the phrase gave her away. Druitt gave a low whistle. "And you remembered her from a summer fair years ago." "I remembered her and the postman," Miss Marple said. He turned pale at the mention of the old rectory. He must have recognized her handwriting on some old letter. That was when she decided to use him instead of risk exposure. The inspector looked at her with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," she said gently. "If you've spent your life watching people, not for what they do in public, but for what they think no one notices." They parted at the door with quiet goodbyes. Druitt would return to his reports and charges. Miss Marple would return to her knitting and tea. But the case was not just closed. It had left the village altered in subtle ways she could already see. Neighbors greeted one another with a shade more warmth, and the vicar's sermon that Sunday spoke gently of forgiveness, without naming names. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her scarf nearly finished, the interlocking diamonds of its pattern neat and whole. She thought of Abernathy in her cell, of Wilkes facing trial, of Arthur Noakes beginning again in Dorset, of Tommy Biggs learning that trust is precious. She thought of the Faradays, their home returning to quiet after the storm. In her mind she traced the story from beginning to end, from a brown parcel to a web of secrets to a final, inevitable unraveling. Outside, the lane was silent. The old rectory stood dark and still, its ivy stirring only in the wind. No more clandestine deliveries, no more coded notes. The ghost in the postman's bag had been nothing more than human resentment wearing a mask of mystery. But it had been dangerous enough. She felt no triumph, only the calm satisfaction of seeing human nature once more revealed for what it was flawed, wounded, but still capable of mending. She laid aside her knitting and reached for her notebook. In small, careful letters she wrote, "Street, Mary Mead, order restored, lessons learned." She closed the book, set it on the table, and smiled faintly at the fire. In the morning she would walk to the tea room as usual, and the villagers would nod and smile and pretend they had known all along. She would say nothing to correct them. Some secrets, she reflected, are best left to fade gently, like whispers at the end of a game, until only their lesson remains. Miss Marple rose before dawn the next day, the cottage still dark and quiet except for the faint tick of her clock. She moved with the same steady deliberation as always, putting the kettle on, setting her knitting aside. Outside, the frost was heavier than before, silvering the lane, so that even familiar hedges seemed to glimmer like something out of a dream. She knew the case was formally finished. Abernathy was in custody, Wilkes charged, Arthur Noakes safely gone. Yet she also knew that in small places like Street Mary Mead, the real aftermath of a crime begins only after the uniforms leave. That was when the whispered theories and new alliances would bloom, when people would decide how to remember events and who to forgive. After breakfast, she walked slowly toward the high street, pausing at each gate to greet the morning as she always did. She wanted to see the village with her own eyes, to take its pulse. Mrs. Hartnell was already at her shop window, setting out jars of jam. She nodded curtly, then blushed and offered a shy smile. Mr. Price tipped his cap as he passed on his bicycle. The vicar came from the church with a roll of papers under his arm, his step lighter than it had been for weeks. These were the signs Miss Marple was looking for. The village was knitting itself back together. She stopped at the tea room and ordered her usual pot of Darjeeling. The chatter inside had softened into something almost normal, half gossip, half relief. Someone at the next table whispered about Abernathy's long grievances. Another speculated about Wilkes's fate. But the edges of excitement were gone. The story was already turning into history. Miss Marple listened without appearing to listen, a faint smile at her lips, her eyes on her cup. Tommy Biggs appeared at her table shyly, clutching a book borrowed from the vicarage. "Mum says to thank you," he said. She says you saved me from getting mixed up worse. Miss Marple patted his hand. You saved yourself, dear, when you brought me that note. That was the bravest thing. He looked at the floor, then back at her. Will everything be normal now? As normal as things ever are, she said gently. But you'll see. It will feel different soon. He nodded and went back out into the morning. She watched him go, feeling the small, bittersweet warmth that always came when a child crossed from innocence into understanding. By midday, Inspector Druitt arrived at her cottage, hat in hand as usual. Thought you might like to know, he said. Abernathy has given us the location of the last cache of letters. We've recovered everything. No one else will be harmed. He hesitated, then added, It was a remarkable thing you did, Miss Marple. You saw the whole pattern before we even had the edges. She smiled faintly. I only noticed what didn't quite belong. A teacher's handwriting, a boy's scarf, a phrase children whisper. People think mysteries are solved by clues, but really they're solved by human nature. It is very repetitive, dear Inspector, very repetitive indeed. He chuckled, shaking his head. You make it sound almost comforting. It is, in a way, she said, eyes twinkling. Because if one knows what to look for, one can also know how to stop it. They spoke a little longer about practical matters, the return of stolen property, arrangements for Arthur's testimony, the discreet handling of villagers' names so that scandal would not ruin lives twice. Then Druitt rose, thanked her again, and left her to her quiet. That evening, as the winter dusk fell over street, Mary Mead, Miss Marple, sat by her fire finishing the scarf she had begun at the start of the affair. The interlocking diamonds of its pattern were complete now, no dropped stitches, each row leading into the next. She bound off the last loop and smoothed the fabric across her lap. It was warm, orderly, and unremarkable to any eye but hers. To her, it was the case made visible, the slow gathering of small threads into a single, inevitable design. She thought of Abernathy in her cell, of Wilkes waiting for trial, of Arthur starting over in Dorset. She thought of the Faradays returning to their routines, of Tommy learning to measure trust more carefully. She thought of the village itself, which would soon absorb this story into its collective memory, like rain into soil. In a year's time, people would speak of it as that odd business with the postman and shake their heads, half disbelieving it had ever been real. Miss Marple rose, folded the scarf neatly, and placed it in her drawer. Outside the window, the old rectory loomed dark and silent, but it no longer felt menacing. It had been only a shell for secrets, and now it was empty. She felt no triumph, only the familiar, quiet satisfaction of having set something right without fuss. Human nature had erred. Human nature had been guided back. That was all. She made herself a cup of tea and settled back into her chair. The fire burned low, casting a soft glow across the room. She reached for a new ball of wool, a new pattern to begin. Another day would bring another small mystery, another puzzle of people and their choices. She was content to wait, knitting and watching, until the next whisper in the village rose and she, unnoticed as ever, began to follow its thread. The following Sunday arrived pale and brittle, a thin sun glinting on the frost-rimmed rooftops. The church bells rang out across street. Mary Mead, with their usual calm insistence, yet in the sound there was a curious note of relief, as though the village itself were exhaling after holding its breath. Miss Marple dressed without haste, her mind as steady as her hands, and walked to the service as she always did. The lanes were quiet, except for the crunch of her shoes on the frozen path. At each gate, neighbors greeted her a little more warmly than usual. They could not quite name it, but they sensed that the dangerous undercurrent that had run beneath their lives had at last gone still. Inside the church, the Reverend Faraday's sermon drifted over the pews like a soft blanket. He spoke of forgiveness, of the peril of hidden resentments, of the duty to guard one's heart even in small matters. His eyes never strayed to Miss Marple, yet she heard in his words the echo of their recent ordeal. Mrs. Faraday sat with her hands folded, face composed, while Tommy Biggs fidgeted beside his mother and tried to follow the hymn. Arthur Noakes was gone to Dorset now, but his name was included quietly in the vicar's prayers. After the service, the villagers spilled out into the cold air, their breath puffing like smoke. They gathered in knots, speaking in lowered tones, but the sharp edge of gossip had dulled. There was sympathy now, where before there had been only curiosity. Miss Marple lingered at the churchyard gate, watching these little exchanges with the same mild expression she had worn throughout the affair. It pleased her to see the threads beginning to mend. Inspector Druitt approached her, hat in hand. "I've finished my report," he said quietly. "Abernathy has given a full statement. Every letter, every parcel, every payment accounted for. She'll stand trial, but with luck some of the villagers she tried to harm will testify to her better years. Even Wilkes has begun to talk about how she drew him in. It may not excuse him, but it explains a great deal." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Explanation is not forgiveness, but it can be a start. It's easier to mend what one understands." They walked together a few steps down the lane. Druitt went on. "There's one last matter. Those letters she kept, some contain things that could still ruin people. We'll return them quietly to their owners. No prosecutions, no public airing. That would be best," Miss Marple said. "Secrets are like weeds. Pull them out too violently and you tear up the garden. Sometimes it's enough to cut them down and let them wither." Druitt smiled a little. "You're a wise woman, Miss Marple." She shook her head, eyes twinkling, merely observant. "Wisdom belongs to those who learn from what they see." He tipped his hat and left her at the gate. She turned back toward her cottage, her steps unhurried. The village lay bright and brittle under the sun, but it felt lighter now, as if someone had opened a window and let the stale air out. She passed the old rectory and paused for a moment. Its shuttered windows reflected the pale sky, blank and unknowing. Without secrets, it was only a house again, its menace gone. At home, she hung up her coat and settled by the fire. The scarf she had been knitting was complete, folded neatly on the table, its interlocking diamonds an invisible map of the case from start to finish. She thought of Abernathy in her cell, of Wilkes facing his reckoning, of Arthur beginning a new life, of Tommy already learning how easily innocence can be coaxed into complicity. She thought of the Faradays, their dignity intact, their quiet routines resumed. In each of these lives she saw not just endings but beginnings. The kettle whistled softly. She poured herself a cup of tea and opened her little ledger. In her careful script she wrote, "The ghost in the postman's bag resolved. Harm contained, lessons understood." She paused, then added, "Village returning to itself." She closed the book and set it aside. For a time she sat without knitting, letting the fire's warmth soak into her hands. The events of the past days drifted through her mind like the last echoes of a tune. There was no drama now, no chase, no confrontation, only the quiet work of life resuming. It was in this quiet that Miss Marple always felt the true weight of a case. The small bruises left on people's trust, the way a village's rhythm faltered before it found itself again. Yet she also knew that human nature, once revealed, rarely surprised her twice. People healed in the same ways they erred, slowly, predictably, with small gestures and everyday routines. Outside the window, the frost was melting, leaving dark patches of earth showing through. A thrush landed on the garden wall, cocked its head, and flew off. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She reached for a new ball of wool and set her needles clicking again. Another pattern, another set of quiet observations, another season of village life to watch. She did not know what story would arrive next in Street Mary Mead, but she was content to wait. The days after the service unfolded with a steadiness that felt almost like healing. Miss Marple resumed her quiet walks through the village, but now she was greeted not with wary glances, but with small nods of respect and gratitude. It was not that the villagers thought of her as a heroine, they did not think of her at all, really, except as the kindly spinster with a sharp eye for weeds in her garden. But some deeper current had shifted. Conversations were softer, glances warmer, and even the gossip at the tea room had a gentler tone. She noticed these changes without pride, only with the same attentiveness she gave to her knitting, recognizing the way a dropped stitch could be drawn back into the pattern before it unraveled. On a bright but cold morning, Tommy Biggs came running up the lane with a letter clutched in his mittened hands. "From Arthur," he said breathlessly, handing it to her. She took it with a smile and read it at her gate while the boy shifted from foot to foot. Arthur wrote of Dorset, of his sister's small holding, of the quiet satisfaction of working honestly again. "Please thank the vicar for me," he added at the end. "And thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing me as more than my mistakes." She folded the letter carefully and told Tommy he had done well. He hesitated. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner about the letters." Miss Marple crouched a little to meet his eyes. "You told me when it mattered," she said. "That's what counts. Just remember in future that grown-ups who ask you to keep secrets are rarely thinking of your good." The boy nodded solemnly, then dashed off, his scarf flaring behind him like a banner. Miss Marple watched him go and felt a small glow of satisfaction. It was a rare thing to see a lesson truly learned. Later that day she paid a visit to the vicarage. Mrs. Faraday welcomed her with warm tea and a plate of scones, her hands steadier now. "It feels as though a shadow has lifted," she said quietly. "I didn't realize how much tension we'd all been living under." "Shadows always seem longer when the sun is low," Miss Marple replied with a faint smile. "Now it is rising again," she asked after Reverend Faraday and learned he was preparing a sermon on reconciliation. She imagined the congregation listening, some of them still harboring their own small grudges but a little more aware now of what such grudges could grow into. Inspector Druitt called that evening. He brought with him the last of Abernathy's ledgers, which he had promised to return discreetly. "We've closed the file," he said. "Letters returned, valuables restored, statements taken. The trial will be quick. She's made no attempt to deny anything." Miss Marple accepted the ledger without opening it and placed it on a high shelf. "Then the matter is done," she said softly. He studied her for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said, that people heal in the same ways they err. It's true, isn't it? Even Abernathy seemed almost relieved once she was caught, as if she wanted someone to stop her." Miss Marple nodded. "Guilt is a heavy bag to carry, Inspector. Sooner or later one hopes someone will take it from one's shoulders." He smiled ruefully. "I'll remember that." After a pause, he added, "You've done more than solve a crime here. You've reminded me what policing is supposed to be about." She inclined her head. "It is about people, dear Inspector. Always about people." When he had gone, she sat for a while in the glow of the fire, thinking of Abernathy's thin, tired face as she was led away, of Wilkes's bewildered shame, of Arthur's tentative hope, of Tommy's small shoulders straightening with new understanding. Each of them was a different kind of thread, some frayed, some knotted, but all of them could be woven into something stronger given time. That was what she had learned long ago, to look at people not as puzzles but as patterns. Outside, the old rectory stood empty and silent once more. Soon ivy would cover the gate entirely, and it would be just another forgotten building in the village's landscape. But Miss Marple knew that for a while at least its name would hold a cautionary echo, a reminder of how quickly quiet malice could turn to danger when left unchecked. She rose, took the finished scarf from her drawer, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was warm and balanced, each diamond perfect, the whole pattern seamless. She wore it as she stepped out into the crisp evening air and walked down the lane. The sky was turning lavender over the hedges, and the first star was out. She passed the churchyard and paused a moment, listening to the soft murmur of voices from the village beyond. Life going on, secrets turning into stories, stories fading into memory. She smiled faintly and continued on, her steps light. She felt no need for applause or thanks. It was enough to know that the whisper had indeed stopped, that the ghost in the postman's bag had been nothing more than a tangle of human spite and sorrow, now untangled, and as always she would be here, knitting quietly at the edge of things, ready to notice the next small oddity that others overlooked. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of frost and the distant, comforting ring of the village church bell. Miss Marple walked slowly along the familiar lanes, her shawl drawn tightly, the patterns of her knitting already etched into memory. The investigation, though concluded in the eyes of the law, had left threads in her mind that demanded gentle, careful attention. She paused at the corner where she had first noticed the discrepancies in the postmarks, the place where the ordinary had begun to tilt into the extraordinary. The lane was empty now, save for the occasional caw of a crow and the rustle of leaves stirred by an early breeze, yet it held a certain memory, a quiet echo of all that had passed. She drew in the cold air and let her thoughts settle, arranging each revelation in the order it had unfolded, connecting motive to opportunity, deed to consequence, and the lives that had been subtly reshaped by those moments. Reverend Faraday had invited her for tea that morning, a small act of courtesy and appreciation that Miss Marple accepted with her usual polite warmth. The vicar, perched by the window with a gaze both steady and reflective, offered no small talk beyond the weather, allowing the quiet to settle as they sipped. Miss Marple appreciated this restraint. Conversation had its rhythm, and so did reflection. The vicar had already set the parish accounts in order, ensuring that the small benefices and charitable distributions would continue without disruption. But there was an unspoken relief in the room that the moral compass of the village had been righted, its hidden obstructions revealed, and its secrets returned to the proper channels. She observed him, noting the subtle light in his eyes when he spoke of forgiveness and of lessons learned. As they spoke, the final pieces of the puzzle, the small indications that had been overlooked, came to the surface. Arthur's letters, carefully hidden and yet poignantly earnest, now seemed less a source of trouble and more a testament to the human frailty that could so easily be exploited. Abernathy's guilt, thinly veiled and bitterly carried, had been a catalyst, not only for her own reckoning, but for the village's awakening to the consequences of secrecy, assumption, and misjudgment. The mislaid parcels, the forged correspondences, and the veiled threats now sat in their proper narrative place, like bricks in a carefully constructed wall, each lending support to the next, each necessary for the structure to stand. Miss Marple rose from her chair, gently smoothing the hem of her skirt. "I should take my leave," she said softly, though neither of them moved. There was no urgency. The morning held a kind of stillness that needed no interruption. "There are always things to notice, Reverend, and always people to guide, even when the matter seems concluded." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've guided more than that, Miss Marple. You've ensured the truth is remembered correctly, and in doing so, you've saved more than reputations. You've saved confidence, trust, and the fabric of our community." Her hands folded calmly over her knitting, the small motions comforting as they had always been. "The smallest details often carry the heaviest weight," she said, her voice a quiet certainty. "And it is in noticing them that we can prevent a larger harm, sometimes without anyone ever knowing it." Later that afternoon, she visited Arthur at his new place of work, a small farm on the outskirts of the village. He greeted her with hesitant enthusiasm, the lines of worry finally softening. She inspected the letters, the account books, and the scattered items he had kept, noting with satisfaction the order he had restored. He looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and something approaching awe. "I don't know how to thank you, Miss Marple," he said, voice low. "You've not only kept me out of trouble, but you've helped me find a way to do right." She smiled gently. "The right path often appears after a mistake is recognized, Arthur. Remember, it is never too late to learn, and it is never too late to act honestly. The consequences will always follow, but so too does understanding." She paused, letting the words settle, then walked with him to the gate, watching him set about his daily work with renewed purpose. By evening, the village had settled into a soft quiet, the kind that came with the fading light of day. Miss Marple returned home, passing the old rectory once more. Its windows were dark, the ivy heavy along the stone walls, but in its silence lay a kind of closure. Every door that had been unlocked, every truth that had been revealed, every secret restored to its rightful place, allowed the building to recede into memory without bitterness. She placed the final letters and records into the safe, her movements deliberate, a ritual of order that mirrored the resolution she had facilitated in life. Outside, the last of the evening light brushed the village with a gentle glow. A cat padded along the lane, a solitary figure paused to watch, and the distant chiming of the church echoed softly, carrying with it the promise of continuity and the quiet acknowledgement of justice done. As she sat by her window with the lamp casting its warm circle of light over her knitting, she reflected on the case in its entirety. Each human action, each misjudgment and deception had been met with a counterbalance, subtle yet inevitable. Abernathy would face the consequences of her choices, yet the village itself would continue, strengthened by the knowledge that vigilance, discernment, and careful observation could prevent calamity. She allowed herself a faint, private satisfaction, not in triumph, but in the harmony restored, the patterns recognized, and the lives gently corrected. Night fell fully, and with it came a peace that had been absent for too long. Miss Marple placed her knitting aside and leaned back, letting the shadows of the room settle into their quiet rhythm. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying nothing but the ordinary sounds of a village returning to its natural cadence. It was in that quiet, in that ordinary serenity, that the final truth revealed itself most clearly. Human complexity could be untangled, order could be restored, and those with the patience to watch and understand could ensure that justice, in its quietest form, would prevail.